Welcome to the House of Brand, where we help unleash the true potential of your brand. If you're a business owner, leader, or C-suite executive and you're ready to scale your business to new heights, you're in the right place. I'm Torey, your guide in turning your brand into a strategic advantage for your company. In each episode, we get straight to the heart of what it takes to build a brand that drives growth, that shapes culture, and fuels your marketing efforts. So let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of House of Brand. Today I have with me Kellie Easley. Kellie's second time on the podcast, so welcome, Kellie.
Thanks, it's good to be back.
Give a brief introduction again of what you do for a profession here at Brandcraft, which is an agency that is behind House of Brand.
So I am the COO here at Brandcraft. I oversee operations, but mostly billable operations for the agency. My background is in marketing and revenue generation in general. So I came to the agency in the PM space and have stayed and loved it.
Yeah, that's interesting whenever you tell that story about how you've, when you first came into the agency as just a project manager and now being the COO, you moved pretty quick through that. And so today's subject that we want to talk about, I think, is a very interesting one, especially as it pertains to brand, because I don't think we've always connected these two.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been in our process probably until about the last 6 months, as we always continue to refine our process, that we started to realize like how values have to play a part in a rebrand and then a branding effort. And so you and I shared an article from Harvard Business Review because we both stumbled upon it as we were researching for this, and it was called "Make Your Values Mean Something" by Patrick Lencioni. It's a great article, even though it's old. That article is from 2002. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
Still, though, I thought it was very relevant. What did you think when you first reviewed the article?
I think it's definitely still relevant. And I especially like the categories that he gives, because I think so many of us that have either been in leadership teams or on the employee side and have interacted with values, so much of it just made sense in terms of what's really a core value and what's not, and what that means to the organization and to employees and customers alike.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. If I just kind of summarize what I got out of it, was this idea that your values have to mean something. They can't be what is called table stakes. Like, we have integrity and we have it's like that that's just a part of operating. So they have to be very unique and differentiated, and they have to have some meat to them. Very interesting in the article. I'm not going to go through all of it, but they did talk about, they kind of presented these values and said, what kind of company do you think this is? And some of the people listening might not be old enough to remember, but the value system that he shared, and in 2002, this is really relevant, it was for Enron, the company that completely went under because of doing bad things financially. And so he shared that just to say, hey, like, the values should mean something and you should live by them. And that was an example of ones that didn't. So let's talk first about, maybe to establish ourselves as a case study. Talk to and tell people about our first value exercise, like how we did it and what it was like. We always kind of joke about certain parts of it at times, but what do you remember of it, and how did we come to our current value system when it comes to Brandcraft, our agency?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So we had a consultant that led us through an exercise at that time. And there were parts of it that were done with leadership, but there was largely this bigger exercise with everybody in the room. And it was really fun and it was really engaging. And I think we did learn a lot about each other during that exercise. But one of the things that stood out was this. And it's funny that I can't really remember it exactly right now, but the phrase was, "You are awesome," and there were little gestures that went along with it, and that sort of took over a lot of the discussion and was the most probably thing the employees remembered most about the experience, and they even made up a little Slack thing to mimic it. But I do think that the exercise was helpful and that we learned a lot, but ultimately the initial set of values that we landed on later had to be augmented quite a bit.
Yeah, I thought that the exercise, if I look back on it, even though that was quirky, what she did during that, it was still fun.
Yeah.
And the result was, like, you looked at it and you're like, okay, yeah, we all agreed that these are the values. And I think if I look back right now on that process, and what we'll talk about today is trying to now kind of go in a different direction and say, how could we have done that different? And then what do we expect in the future to have values that line up with brand, and what does it mean? And I would say that I think that when we went through that process, that the fun aspect isn't bad,
Yeah.
but it wasn't very strategic. It was more like, employees, how are you feeling and how do you want to feel? And then what do you want others to do to make the experience at Brandcraft better? Now, because, there were some, if I remember right, that were like, well, we want to have fun. I want to be respected. And none of these are bad things that you want out of an organization. But did that line up with the things that we had to accomplish as an organization and what we were promising our consumer? And I think we've managed to live with that value system and frame it in a way that we could make it have a little bit more meat on the bone. But it still hasn't been perfect. If we could redo that and go back and do it again, actually, you know what? Let me back up. Maybe it wasn't so much. We've changed a lot as an organization, and that's one thing too, is that it made me realize that if you ask your employees what the values of the company are, it's the value system that they value right there in that moment in time the most, but it's not really strategic in where the company needs to go. And do you remember in this article, I don't remember right off the bat, I probably have it in my notes, what value system did they say that you're trying to reach, but you're not there yet?
Well, one of the great things about that article is they break out different types of initiatives or outcomes that will happen that might erroneously lead to what aren't really values. So your true core values that are authentic to the organization, they do sort of stand that test of time. They're not just about whatever's happening in the moment, right? And he gives us several great examples in there about that, that it's really not about something that the organization is struggling with, like maybe it's collaboration or maybe it's customer response time or something like that. Those would be short-term operational initiatives that you might work on, but those aren't values. Those aren't values issues, and those aren't reasons to create new values or make something a core value. And I think that article does a really good job of talking about that. They're also not supposed to be aspirational either. They should be authentic and true. And I think one of the things, going back to what you said about the process that we undertook, that I would do differently is the stakeholder group. And the article talks a bit about this too, about how you really need to have a small group of stakeholders that are making some of these decisions, and then the rest of the team gets brought in on it later. It's a larger vision and direction thing. And then once the values are set, that's when the team can have input, and that's when the team can sort of figure out how they're going to live those values day in and day out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It kind of mirrors, in fact, if we were doing this with a company, we would probably say whoever is the same stakeholders of your brand and how you're going to define what the brand is as you move forward should probably be the same stakeholders that are defining your values. And I think that's why we decided that during our rebrand process, this idea of values and how are you going to pull this off probably needs to be a part of that. Because once you get done with a rebrand, we think it's as much for the internal people that work in the company during a rebrand as it is for the external, the consumer, client or customer, either one. And if that's so, okay, but how does that work? How do we train? And I think values are a good way to say this is how we live it, and this is how we do it. So aspirational values were the values, I think you might have just mentioned it, but the one that he mentions in the article, and they do say that you don't want all your values to be aspirational, and that you have to be very careful if you implement an aspirational value because people can get confused. And I do agree with that, but I think one of the things I don't agree with are two things. One is that there are still people out there that will say that leadership and managers should not even be a part of defining values within a company, that it should be whatever the people say that the values are. He says it a little bit different, and you just said, it should be this small group. Why do you think that's prevalent, that idea out there that people, meaning I think what they mean when they say that is really the rank and file employees within the company should be the ones determining what those values are.
I think it's out of this desire for consensus and wanting there to be group buy-in and everybody sort of operating from that same mindset, right? Which in and of itself, that's not that that's a bad idea or that you want that, but ironically, it's those core values that actually get you to that. So by establishing what those are, it gives that rallying point for everybody on the team, regardless of what their position is at that time and will be into the future. So I think the outcome actually that they're looking for is the same, but the method is where it falls apart. You really kind of need to establish what those values are, and then the team can orient within them. And they have such a pivotal role that when you think about it that way, it does make sense that that should be coming from that foundational place. This core set of values is something that you're going to make a lot of decisions based on. You make, hiring decisions, training decisions, and sometimes termination decisions. Like everything really comes down to that fit and that core, and leaving that to a large group of people to come to a consensus on is, I think, how you get off track.
Yeah, so there's a quote in here that probably made me think the most, and why I thought, because I think whenever I read something and it makes me think that I haven't thought through it enough, that's when I think I'm reading something really good, is, oh man, I never considered that. But he has a statement: if you're not willing to accept the pain real values incur, don't bother going to the trouble of formulating a value statement. I think what he's saying is, if you're not going to hire, fire, manage, live the values every day, and understand that if those values are real and they're authentic, that there's going to be problems.
Yeah.
Either means some people aren't going to live by them, or you're going to have to make decisions that aren't comfortable because you have to live by your values. That, to me, is the real meat of this, is values have to guide. I mean, they have to have that meat on the bone to guide, and to do that, you have to work really hard to define them. And I think for a lot of clients that we deal with, it is more, well, we're going to take an hour or so in an afternoon, and we're going to define the values, and then we're going to put them up on a board, and all of us are going to kind of, decide that those values are well, we did what we were supposed to do. We have a set of values, and now everyone can look at them. Let's move on. Let's move past it, and then you go to the next thing, and then those values get brought up once a year. Tell people how we have tried to not do that, even though I think that maybe we're at a stage in our company where it would be useful for us to redefine our values. I think we're there. But tell people how we tried to make it within Brandcraft and not something that's just on the wall, or not something that's just like, what are some steps that we've taken to make it something deeper and more meaningful in that way?
Sure. Yeah. I think, well, first of all, there's always room to do more. So as soon as you ask me that question, I immediately go to the place of, are we doing enough? Could we be doing it more? But we have been very intentional about where this fits in. I think where we see the most immediate impact is in recruiting. By being very clear about what our values are and the process that we go about trying to get to know somebody during recruitment, and really understanding whether they're a fit, being very open with them about what those values are, even some of the questions that we ask, the things that we share with them. And then likewise, throughout the journey for employees, we infuse them into as much of what we do as we possibly can. It's part of our performance reviews. It's part of, things that we do in recognizing and rewarding employees. We have what we call values champions, where we talk about and highlight where folks have done a really good job at, sort of living those core values. We find that is both good for recognition, but I think it also helps their peers to see that instead of just something that you and I talk about all the time. They get to see somebody living it out in real time that they can relate to. This is how this applies to me and how I can use it every day. And of course, like I said, there's always things I feel that we could do more, but we do make a concerted effort to make it part of our interactions with each other and with our clients, so that it's part of the natural experience here. Some of the things in the article, rereading it again, that I was reminded of was about those differences between sort of values and norms. Not that they always have to be different, but just because something is a cultural norm inside the company at that time doesn't make it a core value. Doesn't mean it isn't something that's important or it isn't something that you're working on, but that doesn't make it sort of that core value, the essence of what the agency in our situation really is.
Yeah, the ties to our brand process, and then back to this article that he wrote. I think that's what I was so intrigued by. Is like we say the same thing when we're going through a brand with a client. When we're going through the process of identifying attributes and other things within their company that make them different. So he calls those accidental values, and basically saying if you're not going to define values, values are going to be created.
Yeah.
And the same thing we say in brand is even if you don't define your brand is going to be defined either by your customers or by your employees or by somebody, by your customer service, by the work that you're doing. Your brand gets defined. What you're trying to do is define it in your own terms, in your own way, and make people live that. And to bring values in next to those attributes, I think is so important. And this is kind of reinforcing maybe a direction that we're going as an agency, which is we really need to have a modern way of defining values, and we believe that happens during the brand process because there's so many ties to it. So he says accidental values arise spontaneously without being cultivated by leadership, and they just take hold over time. And I think that's kind of what you were alluding to, which is, that they're not accidental. They're just driven from the bottom up. And I think that when you have a really strong group of people that are inciting great change within an organization, that could be okay. That could be great, actually.
Yeah.
It could also really backfire very quickly when a company turns into something it shouldn't. So with that, let's go to aspirational values, because it's one that I struggle with the most. I happen to believe that a lot of the companies that come talk to us, what they really want, or they do want more aspirational values to change and be something different than what they are. But yet, even when I read this article and when I read other people and hear them talking, that values should be established as if who you are right now, based on who you are right now. I have a feel. I'd love to know what you think about this. I don't agree with that. I think that there's certainly, to have stability, let's say you had 5 values. Let's say that 3 are based on principles in which you're currently employed and you're doing a very good job of right now, that are different, that are unique, that are, to what you're doing. But I certainly believe that there should be a couple aspirational values there to have people understand in our training and in our development of all of you guys as marketers, as brand people, as us helping people in business. We should have a couple of these aspirational goals to understand how we can get better. But I'm not certain that's the right way to think about it, but that is how I think about it. I'd be interested to know what you think. Like, how do you think you could use aspirational goals compared to, I don't even know in the article what a standard goal would be, but I would call it, maybe we should call it just a very authentic goal.
Yeah, so I think values should be that authentic core. I don't think generally you should be establishing like true values to the company on something aspirational that's just completely different from where you are today. That doesn't mean that once your core values are established that they never evolve. So I think of things like, I think this is referenced in the article you're talking about, but Nordstrom, and one of their sort of core values is customer service. And what that looks like now is very different from, even 5 years ago, pre-COVID type of thing. And so I think there's always a new level that you're working toward, but I in general, I don't believe that having something aspirational as a core value and trying to have that be sort of a rallying cry for your team, it makes sense for them. I think they need to be able to very quickly identify with what those core values are and know how they're going to live them out in their everyday. But I do think there's other areas where you can set goals, like, which I think is more what you're describing about things you want to achieve or accomplish together as a team or in work groups or whatever that looks like. But as far as like who you are, especially when you look at it from the standpoint of recruiting, managing, training, living that out every day, it should be authentic. It should be something that's part of what the company is.
Yeah, I'll give an example within our agency that maybe paints it a little bit, maybe, or uncovers maybe a little bit about what I'm thinking more than anything, but this idea that maybe like we are a collaborative organization just by what we do, from brand to web to, we have to be communicating and talking, and we don't always do a great job with that, but we do a good job. Like we're good collaborators. But one of the things we always talk about is being better, continuing to be better at collaboration. And so to me, like that's one of those aspirational goals to say that like that let's say you said something like that I almost said something that wasn't going to sound right, but that we are just great collaborators. Let's keep it simple. That's one of our core values. We're great collaborators. And I would say right now, if we believe we're good, but we want to be as great collaborators, that to me is aspirational, but applicable. It's not, no one's going to get confused by that. And I think if we were to ask somebody about maybe you want to join the team, like how do you think you could contribute to our effort to collaborate? And we collaborate to drive great results for our client. How do you think you could help with that? Is that still the same as what you're thinking? Is like, yeah, I'm not sure I would do that. I think I would probably just keep it as maybe just collaboration.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what it's called in there in the article, because he does a really good job of describing it. It's the rules to play or something like that, I think he terms it.
Or permission to play
Permission
values.
to play,
Yeah.
yeah. So to me, those sorts of things kind of fit into that category. It's almost like these are norms and expectations of the culture, and the values are part of that. But to me, that's not a core value per se. That's something that we're working on as a team, or something that we work toward, or expectations that we have for each other in this permission to play category is what it feels like to me, versus an actual core value.
So as we define brand, when we meet with a company, we do some research on them. They answer some questions. They give us a lot of information, and we take that information in, and we have some time to think about it before we go into our biggest meeting on brand, which is that positioning exercise. And in that positioning exercise, we are really being somewhat hard on our client to answer questions and to be more authentic and to be more differentiated than any of their competitors. And I think that's a great time to start thinking about these values as well. Like we've had people tell us that, they believe they have a great culture and their employees are better than their competitors. And likely in some ways they're correct.
Sure.
That when they say that, you're right. Your employees are different. And that doesn't mean that the competitors' employees are bad employees.
Right.
It means the way that that leader's measuring their employees and whether they're better or not are based on a set of criteria and values. We're better at this, and they're not wrong. And so the trick, I think, in values and in brand is to be able to articulate these values that we've set, why they matter and why they're different and why you should pay attention to them. And that is so much more difficult that's so much more difficult to do than it is to say.
Yeah.
I think to get people to say things that are different is very difficult. Because I think we all tend to get into a mode where, we just start listing things off. Oh, we do this, we do this, we do this. And I think you have to have that person in the room that's willing to scratch some of those off and say, this is permission to play. These are just things that, that everybody has to do. What example does he give on the permission to play? He talks about, there's one, integrity. And remember we had a client that actually had that word in their tagline and they used it in all their marketing. He goes on to explain how, basically if you're going to use the term integrity, you're not differentiating. Everybody should have integrity. And my expectation as a client, or maybe let's say as an employee, if I'm going to join your company, my expectation is that you have integrity.
Right.
Like that's permission to play. How do you think that people listening to this podcast that maybe haven't redefined brand or they haven't really gone through this whole process? Number one, we'll put a link to this article. I think this is a good step, is to read through this article and do some do some other reading, and maybe this applies to us as well, Kelly. What do you think you can do? How do you start this process? And I'm kind of putting you on the spot because we haven't talked about this, but let's just throw some ideas out. How would you think you could start this process? And maybe it mimics a little bit of our positioning exercise too, but who do you think should be in that core group? And then how do you think you could start working on some ideas on what these values could be?
I think you have to have the right stakeholders present. And I think in a smaller organization, the tendency is to just want to include everybody, right? Which we've done before. And ultimately, it's not that you don't get any good nuggets out of that, but it's not going to lead you to those core values and the conversation like you were sharing that you get out of a positioning exercise where there's really somebody there leading it that's pushing and asking those questions. Because at first, you're going to get a lot of really surface level things, table stakes, even from us potentially when we do this all the time. But I think it's really key to have leadership present and maybe a few others, and that's really it. That small group of stakeholders and really walking through. And I think maybe some of this is the pain part, although implementation is arguably maybe a bit more painful, but just being really clear and distinct about what those values really are. And I think sometimes these other categories will come out, like the permission to play category and things like that. For Brandcraft, one of them that I could give as an example would be probably candor. That's something that's just part of how we interact, and it's an accepted part of our culture, I would say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a value that in and of itself it isn't enough. It's just part of who we are. But I think ultimately having the right people in the room and being very focused on what it is you're trying to do and not hurry. So it's not an hour-long conversation and then you come out with a list of 7 and then you reduce that down to 5 and you're done, right? This should be an iterative process that you put a lot of thought and care into, even if it takes, 3 to 6 months to get to where you really want to be.
So that's interesting. And that makes sense. So get the right people in the room. And I think that likely includes the strongest leaders, those that maybe founded the company. The CEO for sure should be involved in this. This should not be the HR department that does that. Like it needs to have some real people that can influence those values and that can influence that leadership. So as you start, one of the things you can do in a group setting like that is just start naming some of the values that you think. I was at a conference a couple months ago where someone was talking about values, but they handed out a sheet that had a list of probably 75, maybe less, maybe 50 values on it. It was really interesting to read through that and think about all the different values. And then they were kind of forcing us as an individual to say, which one of those do you live most of your life by? Which one do you tend to lead on? Because you do, and I thought that was going to be hard. Turns out it is hard, but it's also easy to get down to a couple where you're like, I'm almost always making decisions based on those values. And they start to get uncovered and you're like, wow, that was easy. But everybody's path, I think, to get down to those final 2, I named for the first time I went through, I had 25 values. I had 25 and then I had 10. Then to get to 5 was really difficult, but they were trying to get us down to 2. So to get down to 2 was really hard. But I think what you might do with an organization is just put the 50 up there to start with. And then you pick some and you say, okay, some of these are aspirational. Let's put them over here in this category. Some of these are not pay to play, but
permission to play.
Permission to play. Let's move those off. Those are never going to be a part of our value system. And then as you continue to start to move these to different categories, you're left with these very authentic and unique values, which I think would be a great way to do it, and one that we would employ during our brand process, because there's ties to not only how you're unique with your values, but some of that goes to and is very tied to how you deliver on your product and why you're unique. And that's what we're always trying to uncover with brands during the whole rebrand process, which for us is almost not dominated. I always try and give a percentage to it, but I tell people, like, when you go through a rebrand process with us, it's 60% messaging, and it's about 40% visual design and visual brand. And I think some projects that varies. Like sometimes it's 70-30, and sometimes it's more design than it is messaging. But that process of getting to messaging is difficult, much like values would be. Okay, Kelly, why do you think it matters? So you have values defined. Maybe you've gone through a rebrand. You've got all this information. Why do we do it? Why does it matter? Like, what do you do with that as an organization to say, okay, we've defined it, and now this should happen? What should happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think a lot of times once they're done, it's this, oh, we're done. We did it. Let's put a poster up. It's, in our employee manual.
Like that project is done.
Yeah,
So-
that's the end. And then actually, ironically, like most things in marketing, it's never really done. You then have to begin to live it out. And it's part of everything that you do as an organization. You have to train on it. As we talked about earlier in the conversation, it's a recruitment tool, it's a management tool. But interestingly, I think when it's done effectively, what you start to see is that the team starts to find the level of autonomy and independence and things that you would want them to have, which is why a lot of people try to include them from the very beginning. But what happens is it sort of sets this shared rallying core that everybody can get behind. And so you really have to make it something that you're working on all the time. It's infused in everything that you do because that repetition is needed. And in most organizations, employees are busy. They're producing work all day. And so if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And it can't just be something that lives in a document somewhere you talk about once a year during performance reviews. It's got to be, part of the organization. And others have to be able to envision themselves within it. I think it also helps them make core decisions. So when they're up against something, they can turn to that. It's a guide in a lot of different ways for them and help them make decisions that are right for the organization and right for them.
Yeah, I think I'm probably most intrigued by the possibility of that, what you just said, which is if I can put together a system and a set of values and a brand with a positioning statement and all of these things where the employees, when they see it, it allows them to have clarity and make decisions in their day-to-day job. And then how do they respond to a client when they say something, or how do I deliver this project to a client? If it's helping you make decisions along that, I think it's doing a really good job of allowing you to feel confident in your job and what you're doing and how we should approach each client and how we should approach each opportunity. So there's that decision-making, I think, is huge. And I just don't think it's for employees that aren't in management, though. I also believe it helps all the way up to the CEO level and with, and like your role as well as in operations. Let's say that I came to you and I said, or a company did, let's not use us, but let's use us. So we are let's say our digital agency side. And one of our core values is innovation, and it's not that right now. I'm just going to make that value up.
Right.
And they give an example in here of innovations. Okay, that's one of our core values. And I come to you and I say, hey, I got this new opportunity in acquisition, or I think we want to get into printing. And you might say, as somebody that sits next to me in some of these meetings, are you sure that fits our core value of being innovative, is to jump into the print industry? And because in some ways that might feel like you're going backwards, right? Like, why would you do that? That one is pretty obvious, but I think more nuanced than that, there are still a lot of decisions where if you look at it, you say, this opportunity that you're presenting is interesting, but it doesn't line up with our core values, and it doesn't line up with our position in the marketplace. Why would we do it? If you can have more of those conversations that are spurred on not from the CEO, but from others in the organization, that's a positive.
Right.
So I think that using the value system and combining that with brand can really be that big decision-making tool. We didn't even talk about hiring, or the other side of hiring is firing, and that's a part of running a business as well, is really like having a set of very clear ideas about what it takes to live within the organization and also making decisions about the right people that are in the organization as well. Well, this has been a great conversation. I hope everybody listening got something out of it. Kelly, I appreciated your input and your unique perspective. I know we don't always see things the same way as we're evaluating it, so it's always good to talk through it. I think you guys that saw us talk through it, one of the things is we discussed this very little before we jumped on here. And so we're just kind of, and it was a great conversation. I learned a lot. And I think we'll be moving forward and redefining our values soon here too. So with that, thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode of House and Brand.